And welcome to this session, Inclusive Education, College and Career Prep for All. My name is Kristen Brooks, Executive Director with the Riverside County Office of Education, supporting Inclusive Practices projects.
And I'm Kevin Schaefer, Director of Program Support for the El Dorado County SELPIS and the Supporting Inclusive Practices project. We'd like to welcome everyone, and we also wanted to make sure that you had access to more resources or information about the project. So if you'd like to visit our website, it's at www.sipinclusion.org, or you can find us on Facebook or Twitter at SIP Inclusion. We've also created a Padlet of resources for you that any of the resources, the information that we cover in this presentation, you can go to the link that's on the screen now and access and download any of the resources for your own information. You can also contact us by email. Kristen's email is kbrooks@rcoe.us. My email is kevinschaefer@edco.org. So our project's mission and focus is to provide tiered technical assistance to support local educational agencies with Individuals with Disabilities Act Part B, Indicators 3, 5, 6, and 7 of the State Performance Plan. Those indicators are specifically focused on preschool and K-12 least restrictive environment and achievement indicators. We also support 50 leadership teams across the state in their intentional design and redesign of pre-K age 22 systems and supports to increase inclusion and achievement of students with disabilities. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit later about our blueprint that supports our leadership teams in envisioning outcomes, building capacity, implementation of supports and services, and improvement in their culture, as well as scaling and paying it forward to improve outcomes for all students with disabilities. And this is a map that shows where our 50 LEAs that we support in individualized supports and services for students with disabilities, from our most northern LEA up in Humboldt County to our LEAs in San Diego County. And our objectives for today's presentation is to really look back at the history and rationale for inclusive and equitable education. And that's the why we do the work that we do. We don't want history to repeat itself, and we want to continue improving the culture, the policies, and the practices to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. We'll also talk about learner variability and potential barriers in our cultures, policies, and practices within our LEAs that hinder equity, access, and transition support for our students. So that's the who of the work. We'll also go into the SIP blueprint just a bit so that you can see how we do our work to improve outcomes for students with disabilities across supports and services. It's a conceptual framework and can serve as the tools and the intentional redesign of systems. That goes back to our first bullet in gaining an understanding of the history so that we can continue to improve the work that we're doing based on what we are preparing students for in the career and college possibilities. That's the how. And then finally, we'll explore some resources and additionally free professional development events centered on equity, access, and continued improvement. That's the collaboration across all of our systems. We wanted to start with the foundation of the workability mission. And the workability mission is very closely aligned to the Supporting Inclusive Practices mission in the planning and the implementation of an array of services that involves students, families, educators, and employers, as well as other agencies. We know from experience that if we only focus on the special education, the IEP development, without taking a systems approach, we're never going to make the progress and allow for the access for students with disabilities to earn a competitive integrated employment and lifelong learning and a quality of life that is commensurate with all other individuals. And we also wanted to just put on the screen EDCO, because we're also going to talk about universal design for learning. And part of universal design for learning in providing access is to proactively identify potential barriers in the school system so that we can mitigate those barriers and allow for students to have access to their typically developing peers, as well as high quality instruction, so that doesn't become a barrier for students to be successful and self-determined after they leave our system.
So Kevin mentioned not wanting to repeat history. So we want to talk a little bit about how we got here. So what happened in the past and where we're headed in the future. So back in the day, there was this thing called Taylorism and humanism. And so on one side of the fence, Taylorism was really about standardized measures and one way of instructing and one way of working with students and producing a very average student, about average and efficient worker in the workforce. On the other side, there was humanism, where folks thought that students should be creative and innovative and learn about the arts and theater and poetry and really explore being an individual learner in the system. And so what ultimately happened is Taylorism won out, and we can see that reflective of our factories and our educations at the same time. This is back in the 1900s. And so some evidence of this Taylorism in our educational system can be seen in tasks such as the speed at which you can complete your multiplication facts. We probably all remember that growing up in elementary school. And so the question is, what are we really testing? Are we testing students' knowledge and understanding of multiplication, or are we testing speed? And we know what happens if you couldn't do your multiplication facts within 60 seconds. You'd have to practice, practice, practice. And if you still couldn't do it, you would potentially go off to the side, learn in another group, because you weren't average. You weren't fitting the mold of the typical student who could perform within this time frame. And so we see again our factories on the left and our schools on the right, very similar. So on the left, we see the boss walking up and down the aisle, making sure that the workers are facing forward, they're being very efficient and doing the same task in the same manner that is expected of them. And on the right, you'll see the students facing forward, working individually, hands to themselves, no interaction, and the teacher at the back making sure that they're being very efficient in their learning styles. So we see the evolution of curriculum. We're moving away from this standardized system, right? This very individualized one-way average learner system. And so in the 19th century, back then, it was about being right, working alone, sitting still, remembering facts. In the 20th century, it's more about some competition and text-based and summative results, but the teacher still being the expert and kind of that single perspective of learning. And then now in the 21st century, we're seeing more adventurous and creative workers. We're seeing how we can imagine and provide multiple solutions to a single problem. We're showing initiative and persevering through tasks, and we're asking our students to take responsibility and self-evaluate their own learning. So we're seeing this shift not only in our curriculum, but in how we are working with our students and they're working with each other. So when we talk about inclusion and equity and access, this is a little visual. So at the top, you can see that inclusion is really all students with all this variability together in one system or in one setting, learning together. And then on the bottom left, you can see with exclusion, anyone who's different from that green or that average is being excluded or left out on the outside. And then in the middle here, we see segregation, where anyone who's different is clustered together and still on the outside and away from the average learner or away from the average thought of how a student should be. And then on the right, we see integration, where anyone who's different from that average or different from green is together inside the class, but still not really included or working together, kind of off to the side, but in that same setting. So where did this green come from? And it came exactly from what we just talked about in terms of Taylorism, where we have all this variability of learners and we're pumping them through a system to produce this average learner and really teaching to the test, delivering the curriculum, pages 1 through 440, in the school year, and no variability and no really consideration for what our students bring to the classroom that is different and value add. So we're going to be talking today about how to move away from that average learner, embrace that variability in all of our students, again, as value add in our new systems. So grounding us in a little bit of language, Kevin and I love to share this definition. It's an oldie but a goodie, and it really talks about equitable education, eliminating educational barriers and providing equal educational opportunities with the same rigorous standards for all kids. So really, what does that mean to be equitable? And it doesn't mean to water down the curriculum. It doesn't mean to have lower expectations for students. It's how do we change the system, the supports, the resources, the access for students, to break down barriers, to provide those opportunities, and to keep the bar high for all students. And along with this is really celebrating that student identity and not pinpointing a student down to one label. And you'll see in this visual here that students are at the intersection of many identities. They are from various backgrounds and genders and languages and socioeconomic status and orientation and race. And when students enter the system and we impose some of that adult implicit bias, it impacts the student identity. And we start to take away and break down who that student is and all, again, the value add that they bring. And we're focusing on a single identity. And in this example, that identity being disability. And so for kids who qualify for special education or require services, sometimes it's based on a deficit model of thinking, right? That disability status is a negative connotation. So how does that perception impact the student experience and outcomes? And how do we peel back those layers of bias and embrace everything that our students bring every day? So here's a little visual of what inclusion is and is not. It is that educational equity and access that we talked about. It's not dump and hope. It's not a student with an IEP and we dump them in a general education setting and hope for the best without any kind of intentional design for that system to support that student. It's a sense of community and belonging. It's not general education with a one-on-one untrained aide. We've seen that time and time again with all the best intentions and say, well, if we just provide an adult support, they'll be fine in that setting. But we really need to, again, intentionally design the supports for the student as well as the educators working with the student. It's educational benefit, and it's not just mainstreaming or just visiting a classroom. There's research around when a student starts and ends their day in the same setting and has that sense of belonging, it's a very different school experience than students who are just maybe participating for 10 or 15 minutes haphazardly here or there. It's independence and interdependence. It's not what we talk about in terms of line of sight inclusion. You know, I see my peers over there. I see those opportunities across the playground or in the building next door, but I'm not really included or taught alongside. It's a philosophy that all students can learn. And it's not just for compliance to check the box and say, well, we increase the amount of time in general education setting, therefore we've met the mark. It's about breaking down silos and not a my kids, your kids type of an attitude. It's really embracing and owning all of our students on campus. So why inclusive education? And we just wanted to share some of the research with you. There's a slide at the end of this slide deck that has all the references for this information, but we see both for students with and without disabilities, gains in math, language, literature, social, emotional, cognitive outcomes, increased engagement, increased activity and engagement in those activities in the classroom, development of positive views towards differences, which extends well beyond this concept of tolerance, right? And then conversely, no research studies since the 70s have shown academic advantage for students educated in separate settings. And the reason that year marker is so important is because that's when we started to see IDEA and the requirement of free and appropriate public education. So, and inclusion in the least restrictive environment. So once we started seeing these mandates, the research wasn't showing that separation and segregated settings were helpful for kids. So again, check out those references at the end of the slide deck. So our question for you, a rhetorical question here in this session is disability socially constructed? So there's kind of two thoughts around disability. One being the medical model. So you are born with or acquire an impairment. So maybe you were born with cerebral palsy or you acquire a traumatic brain injury. Or on the flip side, socially, you are born with or acquire an impairment, but you're not truly disabled until you come in contact with the people, programs, systems, and structures in the environment or in the educational setting. So question being, what does that mean for schools? And so an example that I like to share is back in a former role I had as director of special ed. One of my jobs was to look at IEPs of students who transferred in from out of state and match them to the most like program of the last signed IEP. And so the student came in from New York. I'm reading a very lengthy narrative IEP about the student who has significant cognitive and physical disabilities or delays. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, where to place the student, where to place the student. And when I get to the end of the IEP, the student was in general education and only had a one-on-one aid for mobility, for transfer to the classroom and sort of navigating the campus. So I thought, well, how do we do that here? How is that going to work for this student? We don't have that. So the question is, did the student become more disabled moving to California because he was doing just fine in New York, at least based on the IEP, right? So that's that concept of that socially disabling condition, right, in the system. So think about what that means as we're working with our students and talking about placements and opportunities and options for kids. Are we, in fact, the ones truly disabling the student? So I'll leave you this before turning it over to Kevin again. When we're not sure what students can learn, we want to presume competence and the ability to learn. We don't want to have that biased view of students simply because they come in with some type of eligibility criteria or something's written on their IEP or in their cumulative file. We want to presume competence at every opportunity.
I wanted to give you a real life example of what Kristen just was talking about in whether or not we as the adults in the system are actually creating limitations for students based on our perception of what that student can do. So the idea of presuming competence is at the forefront of the work that we do. So I wanted to introduce you to Beth and Patrick Forker. Beth works in the Teacher College for UC Davis, and Patrick is her son. And as you can see, Patrick has Down syndrome. And Beth fought and fought and fought to ensure that Patrick was in inclusive settings from the beginning, from preschool through his graduation from high school, that he had access to peers and he was receiving high quality instruction to ensure that he was able to read so that he was able to be independent. And she talks about the immediacy of being secluded as a parent, or the bias, even within the hospital the day that Patrick was born, in the staff putting up a sign, no visitors. That she didn't know, and she couldn't figure out why were her friends and family not visiting. But that idea of the assumption that Beth would be grieving the fact that her son had Down syndrome actually segregated her and Patrick from the joy of introducing him to families and friends, and that was immediate. And then she also talks about teachers who were open and willing to learn how to teach Patrick in a general education setting with support, of course, and others who were resistant. And what she had to fight against was not just his academic progress, but also the opportunity that would have been lost to resolve conflict with his peers, to create friendships with his peers that he would never have experienced had he been in a segregated situation, and it would have limited him after he left our system, in that he had never had the opportunity to learn those social skills that are so critical for students to be successful in college, career, and civic life. So one of the quotes that Beth comes back to often is, early segregation does not merely predict later segregation, it almost ensures it. And we see it in the employability numbers, the access to college numbers, etc. So the picture on the left is when Patrick was very young, all the way through to Patrick's graduation from high school. And you can see the elation in Beth's face. But I really wanted to get to the next chapter in Patrick's life. And this is a post that Beth put on social media. And it's Patrick going back to George Mason University for his second semester as a college student in the movie director program, living independently in a four-year college, and developing a set of friends that support him in moving forward toward graduation from college. And the point here is that if as adults, as educators, we don't know or understand that these opportunities, these college opportunities, are available for students with significant cognitive disabilities, we will never teach them and support them in gaining the academic skills and gaining the social skills to be successful. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we limiting our students with disabilities based on our assumption of what they can't do? And we also wanted to put up the 16 colleges across the country that do have four-year programs for students with significant cognitive disabilities. along with residence that's available for them too. So Patrick attends George Mason University on the East Coast, living independently, as I said, and it's fascinating watching everything play out over social media between Beth and Patrick. And Beth really knew that Patrick was independent when she received a Facebook request from Patrick saying, "Hey mom, guess where I am?" And she said, "Oh Patrick, I don't know." And I'm in the back of an Uber that I called with my friends going to a Super Bowl game. And she's like, "You know what? All the fight was worth it. This is exactly where I wanted Patrick to be, in knowing who he is, being able to advocate for himself." And that was all possible because he was in integrated settings throughout his entire educational career.
So the question now is, what are the barriers to the next evolution? How are we going to move away from this average learner in these segregated settings for students and really embrace all the variability of our learners and truly include students together in the system? And one of the books that we often point to is called The End of Average by Dr. Todd Rose, who's a professor at Harvard and also a former high school dropout. And in this book, if you haven't read it, it's a great read. But he talks about really demystifying the average learner, that there really isn't an average student or a right in the middle of that bell curve type student that we should be teaching to. And he talks about how even in the bigger world, right, the corporate world, that there are challenges with this thought of average. And he talks about in the Air Force and fighter jets and how the cockpits were made for the average pilot. And they really weren't fitting anyone. They were excluding pilots who couldn't fit in these cockpits. And so they talked about making an adjustable seat and going to different companies to redesign the plane to be able to fit a range of pilots. And yes, it was costly, but what ended up happening is they've included more pilots in the Air Force than ever before. We see more female pilots, smaller in statute in some cases, than we ever have before. And same thing on the opposite end, we see much taller and larger pilots able to fit in this cockpit because of the adjustable seating. Had nothing to do with their ability, their competency level, their skill set. It was all simply the barrier of the seat itself. And so when we talk about this kind of analogy with curriculum, if we start with this average curriculum and start with this average fighter jet, and then look at our average students and our average pilots, what's going to happen is we're going to end up having to design a curriculum or an IEP or a fighter jet for every student and pilot out there. And it's like playing whack-a-mole, one for you and one for you and one for you. And you're just running around like crazy trying to design individually after the fact, thinking that you have to meet this mythical average. So instead, if we think about the variability of students and pilots from the get-go, and then we start to design the curriculum, the lesson plans, the cockpit, the environment, we get what we call happy planes of love, right? We're moving away from this average curriculum and we're producing something that's been designed with students in mind first. So another analogy that we like to use, and of course we're using a pyramid here because California is all about pyramids, right? And triangles. And so in this tiered visual, we're gonna give you a little scenario here, but thinking about how resources are in tiers, not students, right? So resources and supports are in tiers. It's not students that are, these are tier 2 kids or tier 3 kids that we often hear. That kids should be able to access those resources and supports throughout the system and throughout the tiers based on the given context and setting. And Kevin's going to talk about expert learning and how students need to be able to find out where those resources are, how to access them, and when they need them based on the context themselves instead of us telling them what they need and when they need it. So in this example, think to yourself about just getting ready for this session today, for this institute. What did you need to prepare? What did you need to really be able to engage? Did you need to access tier 1 support? So you were looking for an alarm clock to wake up and be able to complete all the sessions. Did you need a cup of hot coffee? Did you need to access supports in tier 2, where maybe you needed an alarm clock, a cup of coffee, and and also a hot breakfast? Or are you accessing resources in tier 3 and say, you know what, it doesn't matter any of that, this should have started later. Or this session I'm listening to right now should only be 10 minutes, right? And so you were just unable to, or really struggled with accessing the session because you were really striving for those tier 3 type supports. Or did you not need any of these resources, any of these tiers, and you were on the very bottom and you took a run this morning. You went for a run, or you worked out in your home gym, or whatever it may be, and didn't need to access any resources because you're really motivated about inclusion, right, in this session. So thinking about how context changes. And when Kevin and I travel in a normal day, normal society, we're on the road often all over the state, presenting and working with leadership teams. And when I travel, I have to access tier 3 supports. I need not only the alarm clock on my phone and the one in the hotel for a wake-up call, but I also ask my husband to give me a call and help me wake up because I'm afraid I'm going to be late. And that's just traveling and wanting to, be on time and make sure that I'm delivering the best I can. When it's a Saturday morning and it's soccer or going to the beach or something with the kids, I don't need an alarm clock. I pop up right away. So context matters. I don't need to carry 3 alarm clocks with me everywhere I go. It depends on the context.
So what does that mean for instruction? How do we create accessible instruction for all students that lead to expert learning? And we're going to talk about specifically what expert learners have a profile. So we talk a lot about universal design for learning, which is based on the universal design for architecture and proactively planning for the most accessibility across the most individuals in our architectural design. So the picture that's on the screen now, you can see that it's not just a stairwell. For individuals who aren't able to access stairs, it creates a barrier. So by the addition of ramps, by the addition of bars to hold on to, it allows access for everyone, not just individuals with disabilities, but think about strollers. Think about individuals who are carrying heavy objects. So we talk frequently about designing for the margins allows access for everyone. The same thing is true in our universal design for learning, in that we proactively design by identifying potential barriers, mitigating those barriers, so that the first instruction that all students receive is accessible as possible. So let's dive in a little bit deeper into universal design for learning as an inclusive practice. So the definition of universal design for learning is that it's a scientifically valid framework for guiding practice that, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this first definition. It provides flexibility or options in the way that information is presented. That means information coming in. So students have to be able to understand, they have to make sense, and they have to comprehend that information and be able to store it in long-term memory. So the way that we provide options and the way that students process information is critical to universal design for learning. Also, providing multiple means for ways that students can respond or demonstrate knowledge and skill. This is their expressive skills. This is the principle of universal design for learning that allows teachers to understand where students currently are in their learning and to make instructional decisions moving forward. And then finally, providing options for ways that students are engaged. Not every student is going to be engaged and motivated and to be able to self-regulate in the way that every other student does. So by providing options, students learn more about how they engage in the information, how they respond most validly and reliably, and the way that they're able to make sense of the information. And these are the 3 principles. And you see that the 3 principles are color-coded. So we'll come back to the guidelines so that you can make sense of how the instructional cycle is related to universal design for learning. And as I said earlier, UDL reduces barriers in instructions by providing appropriate accommodations, supports, and challenges while maintaining high achievement expectations for all students. And that goes back to what Kristen was talking about. We have to presume competence from all of our students and then provide accommodations appropriately. And it's important to understand that even though universal design for learning sometimes gets pigeonholed into instruction for students with disabilities, UDL is actually a tier 1 universal level of support for all students because we all context in which we're learning. And variability. Student variability is a term that's very specific to universal design for learning. And Kristen talked about the fighter pilots with the N of average. If we design our curriculum and our assessments based on a mythical average, we're actually teaching and assessing no one. So we have a variability or a variable learning profile with each of our students. And everyone's learning profile, their jagged learning profile, looks different because we all have different experiences, we all have different background, we all have different areas of interest. So our jagged learning profile, by providing options, we are reaching the most students as possible to access the instruction and the social emotional skills that all students benefit from. So UDL guidelines. This is probably, if you're familiar with UDL at all, you're most familiar with the guidelines. And we're going to go through the guidelines in the way in which the guidelines actually lay down a process for understanding and honoring and celebrating student variability, and then using that variability as a strength in the educational system so that all students move toward being expert learners, which is the goal of universal design for learning. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into how to read the guidelines so that you can see the resources that are available in moving students toward becoming expert learners. So you'll notice at the top, there are 3 principles, and the term principles applies to each of the columns. So the first column is engagement. The second column is representation. And the third column is action and expression. Each column is called a principle. And with engagement, for example, that's our social emotional principle. So you can see that we're recruiting interest. We're working with students to sustain effort and persistence so that they can continue working toward the goal of the lesson, and eventually want them to be able to internalize those skills to self-regulate. In order to self-regulate, they have to understand themselves and what they need. And how they can continue toward working toward their goal. If we move over to representation, this is the principle that it's receptive language. It's information in. It's how we make sense of patterns. It's how we are able to move from short-term memory to working memory to long-term memory. So repetition and relationship is the way that students are able to memorize information, put it into long-term memory, and then access it when it's needed. So now we're looking at perception, how students perceive information. We're making sure that the language and the symbols that we use are understandable by students. And then eventually we want students to be able to find ways that they can comprehend that information in the best way that they learn. And then finally, our last principle of action and expression, this is the expressive skills. This is our access to our executive functioning skills in the way that we plan, we organize, we prioritize. And if you're watching this webinar, you know that those executive functioning skills are critical to the success of students in their college life, in their work life, in their civic life. So the executive functioning skills are that internalized, high non-cognitive skill that we want all students to be able to access. So we have each column being a principle, and then within each principle, we have guidelines. There are 3 guidelines in each of the principles. There are 9 guidelines in all, and they're highlighted on the screen now. The guidelines are also available at the link at the bottom of the screen. If you go to that link, you will find multiple representations of the guidelines, but there's also interactive guidelines where you can click on any of the principles, any of the guidelines, any of the checkpoints, and it will take you to more resources and more tools to deepen your understanding of what each of the principles, guidelines, and checkpoints entail. And then with the guidelines, within each guideline, we have checkpoints. Checkpoints are denoted by bullets, and they're very specific to how we work with students to ensure that we're moving from teacher-centered instruction to student-centered instruction. So we'll talk a little bit about how we move through each of the principles, guidelines, and checkpoints to ensure that our students are developing as expert learners. So we can read We can read the guidelines horizontally or vertically, and we're going to start with horizontally. So at the top, the first three guidelines across the top: recruiting interest, perception, and physical action. This is where the onus is predominantly on the teacher. The teacher is recruiting the interest. The teacher is designing the environment so that students are able to perceive and understand the information, and also accessing physical action. So these are very external of the student. They're just learning how to access engagement, representation, and action expression. But as we move into the second row of building, now the teachers and students are working together to build the skills for students to sustain effort and persistence, ensuring that students are able to understand the language and symbols that are being used, and providing multiple ways for students to express themselves and to communicate information so that the instructors are receiving valid and reliable information to make those next step instructional decisions. And then finally, we want to move students to internalizing. We want them to be able to access, we want them to be able to self-advocate for what they need in each of those principles. So now we want the responsibility for students' education to move toward the student, the onus to take responsibility of learning from the student's perspective. So now they can ask for what they want, they can self-regulate their emotions, they can comprehend information, they can access their executive functions to be successful. And as I said earlier, the goal of Universal Design for Learning is to create expert learners. So if we read the guidelines vertically now, we are moving from teacher onus at the access level, collaboration between teacher and student at the build level, and then the onus or responsibility being on the student at the internalized level, with the result, the goal of UDL being the creation or development of expert learners, so that students are purposeful and motivated, they're resourceful and knowledgeable, and they're strategic and goal directed. And we also wanted to include implementation tips. And you'll see at the top of this graphic that the transference of responsibility from teacher to student is critical to this process. And it's not just academic transference, but it's transference to problem solving. It's transference to engaging in the information that's being taught. It's the social emotional skills. But the important part of this is that we want to make sure that students, by the time they leave our system, are independent and they're able to be self-determined on the goals that they set for themselves. And if we use the principles of Universal Design for Learning throughout the entire system from preschool to the age of 22, we're consistently working students toward becoming self-determined and expert learners. And we can do that through the IEP process. So just a quick reflection for you, and you can pause the presentation, but we'd like you to think about this sentence down. In my opinion, the #1 quality of a student who is college, career, and civic life ready is blank. And then why? Because of, why did you pick that adjective? And when you pick that adjective, that's the definition of an expert learner. An expert learner is not a student who can play the game of school or be in a gifted program or gets all A's and B's. An expert learner is that whole idea of being independent, understanding who you are in the educational system, transferring that beyond the educational system so that we can be as independent as possible. We have to go back to that idea of adults potentially lowering standards are creating barriers in the educational system. By identifying those barriers early on, we're able to open up access to instruction for more and more learners. English learners, students with disabilities, gifted, students who struggle, etc. And just a little bit more information on an expert learner. What we'd like you to do is take a moment to read through each of the bullets. And this is the definition of an expert learner, but it's also the definition of a student who is successful in that humanism component that Kristen talked about earlier. These are the students that know themselves. These are the students that are able to access the connection and the importance of what they're learning to how it will be impactful for them later in life when they leave our system. work with Lodi Unified School District as one of our grantees in the Supporting Inclusive Practices project. And one of the connections that they've made is that even with a quality transition program, they had to move back to preschool and connect preschool and the entire K-12 system to their transition work that they do. So if we start working on transition and career college awareness when a student turns 16, it's too late. So in the preschool career readiness, the K-4 career exposure, grades 5, 6 career awareness, 7, 8 career exploration, and then career preparation so that students are successful. Within each of those grade levels, we're really looking at creation of expert learners so that we aren't waiting until it's too late, but framing the educational system around career success. And of course, person-centered and driven IEP planning is critical to the development of expert learners. So having students understand early on what is in their IEP, how what is in their IEP is actually a support to them, not a deficit, and creating the IEPs around an asset-based perspective is critical for students to develop a self-image that is positive and that they have input and positive impact on the educational system, not just themselves, but their peers and the adults. And Katie Novak, one of the national world experts in universal design for learning, really focuses on a multi-tiered system of support that is integrated through the lens of universal design for learning. And she uses the analogy of a dentist, that we all go to the dentist for our checkups. It's a tier 1 level of support, but there are also times where the dentist will find a cavity. The dentist can fix the cavity, but it's a higher level of intense support. Dentists will also find that we need braces. When we move into the need for braces, it means we're moving into another expert, and a person who has a more focused area of expert to meet our more intensive need. So it doesn't mean that when we go to the ophthalmologist that we stop seeing the dentist. So as Kristen said earlier, throughout that tier system of support, students are receiving tier 1 level of support, tier 2 level of support, tier 3 level of support, even though they're in a different tier. So students aren't in tiers, but the supports are. And then there are times when we have an infection. That means we might need to go to the periodontal, but we don't stop seeing the ophthalmologist, we don't stop seeing the dentist in that whole process. So you can see how the supports have to be aligned in the same way with our educational system. And then you also have this resource on your Padlet. You'll see at the very top that it starts with standards, and all of our IEP goals, all of our instruction have to be aligned to the grade level standards. It doesn't mean that students with disabilities have their own set of standards, but their goals and objectives and instruction also need to be aligned to those grade level standards. So we start with an understanding of grade level standards, ensuring that our lesson objectives are all accessible for all students. And then at the bottom of the graphic, you'll see it says instruction. High quality, equitable, accessible instruction starts with universal design for learning. And even though universal design for learning within Common Core is only mentioned in the application for students with disabilities, as I said earlier, it is meant for everyone. And then into the center is the IEP development. And the IEP development is couched between grade level standards, high quality instruction, and then the IEP process to ensure that all students with disabilities are able to be independent and interdependent, as Kristen said, and successful in college and career. And on the back of that graphic, there are questions for family members to ask around educational benefit. And the family engagement component is also critical to the process of developing IEPs. And we want to make sure that we take the parent input in the IEP from a positive perspective and integrate that into the IEP development. This is also a really great document to align all supports and services to make sure that students with disabilities are in their least restrictive environment, and that communication pathways between general ed and special ed and related services are all in place to support the student.
So we also wanted to just point out some other resources that are available, especially during this pandemic when we are in a virtual world, and providing transition services for students can be a little bit more challenging. So these resources are here for you. Again, you can explore these on the slide, but anything around resources for students and families in terms of how to time those transition meetings, because we know that our attention to things like Zoom and Google Meets is a little bit lower these days because we're so inundated with online learning and supports. But again, there are several links here for you for some more ideas, tips, and tricks in terms of virtual transitions. And here's an employability rubric offered by Vallejo City Unified School District that they use. And this really ties back into everything Kevin was sharing around universal design for learning and creating expert learners and taking onus of our own learning and progress and independent skills. And so this is just another tool that you can use where the students, the parents, the transition support providers can be filling in this rubric in terms of what is the goal that we're trying to achieve, what input has the student had on those goals, and where can we support the student to move through the system and scale up their skills and their independent status. So again, another tool for you to access and replicate, use as a template in your own school communities. So how do we mitigate these barriers? How do we ensure that we're not repeating history and that we're not focusing on the average student and that we are embracing variability and providing options and choice and getting our students to that level of expert learning? Well, it starts with really having a clear path and a clear vision. And so on the left, the picture you can see if we're, let's say, driving down the road and in the normal world, we would be meeting you at the Institute and we'd be offering this session in person and driving to see you. And so let's say the sky was clear and our windows were down and the radio was up and we're singing along and we can see very clearly ahead of us. But then on the right, the conditions start to diminish and it starts to rain and it gets cloudy and overcast and our visibility, our vision isn't what it was. So we change our behavior, right? We roll up our windows, we turn down the radio, we lean forward 10 and 2 and we're very quiet and focused. And if our visibility is so poor and we don't know how to navigate the road, we ultimately end up pulling over. And so that's what happens if we don't have a clear plan or a clear path and expectations for our students and our families and everyone on board at the same time. We're going to end up just sort of pulling over and waiting for this to pass, right? And unsure of how to navigate this. Similarly, another analogy is if Kevin and I gave you several puzzle pieces and said, please choose your team members and put this together, take all the time you need, you could do it. But it would really be helpful if you had a picture of what it was supposed to look like. So it's really critical when we work with our leadership teams and meet with different members that we talk about first, what is your vision? What is this supposed to look like? What are the expectations? What are the strategies to get there? And is everybody clear and on the same page with that? And we really focus on these essential elements of inclusion. And we start with, what is your culture of inclusion? What do you believe about all students? What do you feel when you walk on that campus or you enter that virtual online session? Does it feel warm and inviting and inclusive? Do all adults believe that all students can learn? Do all students believe all students can learn? And then what are the policies that really enforce that culture and really perpetuate that culture? And then what are the practices that are happening in the classrooms and in those meetings and those transition services that are backing those policies and that culture of inclusion? And it really takes leadership at the center and leadership at all levels for the system to work. And one of the things that our team has created is what we call the blueprint, the SIP inclusion blueprint. And it starts with sort of these phases and moving through the system and starting with envisioning and who's on your cohesive leadership team. What is your vision, mission, and what are your values? And is there an urgency of purpose in ensuring that our students are included and building toward that expert learning to be independent lifelong learners? And the persuasion and first adopters, who's really in the boat to change the system so that we're not perpetuating an old cycle. And then we move through building and looking at our data and our root cause analysis and having those clear strategies and goals. And then we start implementing different structures and systems to support all kids that are intentionally designed or redesigned. Oftentimes when we work with our districts, they have jumped to implementing because it's a knee-jerk reaction either to red on the California dashboard data systems or something is out of compliance. And so they just say, well, we're going to start this then in reaction to some compliance indicators. And that's not where we want to start. We really want to be clear with our envisioning and our building before we implement, to then ultimately be able to scale up a good working system for kids and families, to then pay it forward and become an exemplar for others and mentor them through this as we're all learning in this new age. And so again, starting with envisioning before taking on all of those next levels for implementation and scale up. And we also want to direct you back to our SIP website, because there's a plethora of information on this website. So if you go to sipinclusion.org and you see these tabs at the top, you can learn about the project and who the grantees are and who we are, who the team members are, a little bit of bioinformation, what we do in terms of professional learning that we'll talk about in just a second, the why behind inclusion, and then there are some distance learning innovation resources specifically to what's happening in our current pandemic right now. Kevin and I were a part of this Innovative Solutions Work Group, and this team created a series of vetted resources and supports online in different categories, different areas, so maybe for administrators or students with more significant disabilities. So a whole range of resources that are available for you there that are archived and updated. And then there's also the EDGE newsletters that are now electronic and posted to our website. So if you're interested in that statewide newsletter that comes out a few times a year, it's now available electronically for you on the website. So I mentioned this professional development, and that's under one of the tabs of what we do. And so we provide tiered supports, as Kevin mentioned, and one of those tiers is tier 1 is professional development for anyone in California who wants to access, and actually we have some followers that are international, right, Kevin, on our social media, but this professional development is at no cost. And so it's in areas like universal design for learning, or co-teaching, or data, or transition services. We had a whole series last year, or early childhood, you know, it could be around equity. So there's a variety of topics that we address based on what our grantees are telling us they need in the field. And so again, you can access that, check back at the website and register for any of those free events. Oops. And then lastly, that was just the reference slide in terms of the research that we talked about earlier about how inclusion really benefits all. It benefits students with and without disabilities, and that we're not seeing the research that segregated classrooms are supporting students to become expert, lifelong, independent learners. So lastly, as we close, we just want to leave you again with our email addresses. We wish that we were in person with you, and sorry that we have to record this and send this on, but please feel free to reach out to us at any time and ask questions if you want more information, more resources. We would love for you to be part of our inclusion family. So we really want to thank you for your time and attention in this session, and hope that you have a great rest of the Institute and stay healthy and well.